The world has always belonged to those who understand a simple truth. Most people move through life like chess pieces that haven't learned they can refuse to be moved. They wake up, they follow the rules they were taught, they defer to authority, they seek approval from people who barely think about them, and they spend their days hoping that obedience will eventually be rewarded. But there's a version of power that exists outside of this game entirely. A version that doesn't require you to be the loudest in the room, or the richest, or the most politically connected. It requires something far more dangerous and far more elegant: the willingness to understand how power actually works, and then the discipline to stop being a victim of it. When we think of Niccolo Machiavelli, we think of a man who wrote about how to manipulate others, how to lie convincingly, how to seize power through cunning and deception. We imagine a cold, ruthless strategist who saw human beings as nothing more than tools to be exploited. But this interpretation is so catastrophically incomplete that it's almost become a disservice to what Machiavelli actually understood about human freedom. The real Machiavelli wasn't interested in creating more tyrants. He was interested in describing a path to sovereignty, a way for ordinary people to stop being controlled by the tyrants, the manipulators, the systems, and the people around them who had already learned to play the game. And the foundation of that sovereignty, the root of all his insights, comes down to one principle that almost no one practices: the absolute refusal to be controlled by fear or the desire for approval. Let's begin with the most uncomfortable truth about why people can be controlled in the first place. It's not because they lack intelligence. It's not because they're weak or pathetic. It's because they have something to lose, and someone else knows what it is. Think about the structure of control in any human relationship, whether it's a marriage, a job, a friendship, or a social dynamic. One person can only control another person if that second person cares more about keeping something than they care about their own freedom. The employee can be controlled by the boss because losing the job feels like losing survival itself. The partner can be controlled because the thought of abandonment is unbearable. The friend can be exploited because the fear of judgment is paralyzing. The citizen can be dominated because the threat of punishment or social exclusion feels too dangerous to resist. Machiavelli understood this with absolute clarity, and what makes his thinking so revolutionary is that he didn't just describe how this control works, he showed you how to become immune to it. The method is brutally simple, which is why most people never actually do it. You must reduce your dependence on anything that anyone else controls. You cannot be threatened by losing your job if you have the capacity to survive and create value elsewhere. You cannot be devastated by abandonment if you have built a life that is complete without that one person. You cannot be destroyed by judgment if you understand that the people judging you are probably thinking about themselves far more than they're thinking about you. You cannot be broken by punishment if you have already decided that certain principles matter more to you than comfort. This is not about becoming a sociopath. This is not about hurting people or manipulating others or abandoning everyone you care about. Quite the opposite, actually. Machiavelli's real insight was that the person who understands they cannot be controlled is the only person in the room who is actually free to choose how they want to behave. The person who is terrified of losing their job will lie to their boss, will compromise their values, will participate in things they know are wrong. The person who has made themselves independent from that job can choose to work with integrity. The person who is desperate to be loved will people-please themselves into a hollow shell of performance. The person who has built a life where they don't need anyone else's validation can actually be genuinely kind, because their kindness isn't a transaction designed to secure affection. It's an actual choice. Here's where most people misunderstand Machiavelli, and it's a critical distinction. They think he was recommending that you become ruthless, that you manipulate everyone around you, that you climb over people to get ahead. But Machiavelli lived in Renaissance Italy, in a time of constant warfare and political intrigue. And what he was actually trying to do was describe reality as it existed, not as people wished it to be. He was saying, this is how power works. These are the moves that people actually make. And if you want to survive and maintain your freedom, you need to understand this game. You need to see that your enemies are already playing it. The people trying to control you are already using these principles. The systems that dominate your life are already built on these foundations of understanding human psychology and dependence. So you have two choices. You can remain naive and vulnerable, or you can learn to protect yourself. The first move in that protection is to understand that the people you're dealing with are not as mysterious or unpredictable as you think they are. Humans follow patterns. We're shaped by incentives. We want certain things: status, security, pleasure, legacy, belonging, and we will compromise our stated values in pursuit of those things far more often than we'd like to admit. When you start looking at the world this way, you stop taking things personally. Someone criticizes you harshly? That says something about their insecurity, their need to feel superior, their fear that they're not good enough. Someone manipulates you? That's because they believe at some level that they're not capable of getting what they want through honest means. Someone abandons you when you're struggling? That says something about their inability to sit with discomfort or their own fear of being pulled down. Now, the truly powerful move is this. Once you see these patterns clearly, you become much harder to hurt. You develop what Machiavelli essentially describes as emotional armor. Not because you become cold or disconnected, but because you stop personalizing other people's behavior. And when you stop personalizing it, you become free to choose your response rather than react from a wounded place. If your boss is harsh with you, you can see that it's probably about his own fear of inadequacy or his own need to project control, and you can decide how you want to respond, whether that's with compassion, with distance, or with a quiet determination to find a situation where you're treated better. You're no longer a victim of his behavior. You're not scrambling to prove your worth to someone who was never going to give you what you needed anyway. The second principle that Machiavelli implicitly understood is that visible weakness invites exploitation. This is a hard thing to say in a culture that values vulnerability and emotional honesty, but it's true nonetheless. There's a difference between being authentic and being defenseless. You can be genuine, honest, and kind without broadcasting every fear, every insecurity, every desperate need you have. In fact, people who do broadcast all of this tend to attract parasites. People who sense that here is someone they can manipulate, someone who is seeking validation so desperately that they'll accept crumbs of attention. Machiavelli wasn't saying you should be dishonest. He was saying you should be strategic about what you reveal and to whom. Think about how predators work. They're not sophisticated in their methods. They actually tend to be quite simple. A predator looks for someone who is lonely, who needs connection, who is so desperate for belonging that they'll ignore red flags. A manipulative person looks for someone who is insecure, who constantly second-guesses themselves, who sees other people's opinions as more valid than their own. A controlling person looks for someone who is afraid of poverty, of abandonment, of failure. These predators aren't geniuses. They're just people who have learned to recognize the signs of vulnerability, and they've learned that there's no consequence for them if they exploit those vulnerable people. Now, here's what's revolutionary about understanding this. Once you make yourself less vulnerable, once you develop actual competence and resilience, once you build a life where you have options, the predators naturally lose interest. You're no longer an easy target. More importantly, the people around you shift how they treat you. People are very attuned to these things, even if they're not conscious of it. If they sense that you're desperate, they'll take advantage of that. If they sense that you're strong, that you have alternatives, that you can walk away, they suddenly treat you with more respect. They're more careful about how they speak to you. They think twice before they try to manipulate you. This isn't because you've done anything cruel or manipulative in return. It's simply that you've removed the incentive to exploit you. Let's go deeper into how this actually works in practice, because this is where theory meets the real messiness of actual human life. Imagine you're in a relationship with someone, and that person has learned over time that you will accept mistreatment from them. Maybe they criticize you constantly. Maybe they're unfaithful. Maybe they just don't show up for you emotionally when you need them. The reason they do this isn't because they're suddenly going to change and realize how much they hurt you. It's because they've received no real consequence for this behavior. On some level, they've learned that you're not willing to leave, that you'll negotiate downward. Now, what happens if you change? What if you spend 6 months getting your life together? You rebuild your friendships, you invest in your own interests, You save some money. You start thinking about yourself with genuine compassion instead of desperation. You start dating other people or you start going out and having fun. You become someone who, in real terms, doesn't need this relationship. This isn't a game or a tactic. It's a genuine shift in your psychology and your circumstances. Almost invariably, the person who was treating you poorly will suddenly change their behavior. They'll want to spend more time with you. They'll be more attentive. They'll ask you questions about your life. They'll try to win back your affection. And sometimes people interpret this as manipulation on their part, like they're just playing games to recapture you. But often what's actually happening is that they're responding in real time to the fact that the power dynamic has shifted. You're no longer easy to control, so the cost-benefit analysis has changed. This principle applies everywhere. In the workplace, the person who is desperately clinging to their job, who's terrified of being fired, who's willing to do anything to keep their position, is the person who gets exploited the most. They'll work unpaid overtime. They'll shoulder responsibility for other people's failures. They'll accept less pay than they're worth. They'll compromise on boundaries. But the person who is invested in their own skills, who knows they can get another job, who has some savings, who has started their own side project, that person is the one who gets raises, who gets respected, who doesn't have to pretend to be interested in the office birthday party. The employers or the bosses sense the difference. And here's the thing that makes this so elegant and so important. This isn't dishonest. You're not pretending. You're not being manipulative. You're genuinely changing your circumstances and your psychology. The shifts in how people treat you are real consequences of real changes you've made. You've become someone who is harder to control, and the world responds to that. But you've done this not by hurting anyone or deceiving anyone, but by investing in yourself. This is what Machiavelli was actually recommending, not tactics to manipulate others, but a fundamental shift in how you live so that you're no longer available to be controlled. The third principle, which is essential to this whole framework, is understanding the nature of reputation and image. Machiavelli wrote extensively about how a ruler is perceived, and the core insight is that perception and reality are not the same thing, but perception matters far more than most people realize. Now, in a modern context, this doesn't mean you should pretend to be something you're not. It means you should be very intentional about what you communicate to the world, and you should understand that the narrative people have about you is often more influential than the truth. If people believe you're weak, you'll be treated as weak. If people believe you're unstable or easy to manipulate, you'll be treated that way. If people believe you're strong and that you're not someone to be trifled with, you'll be treated very differently. There's a reason why confidence, real confidence, not arrogance, is so attractive and so powerful. Confident people don't broadcast their insecurities. They don't constantly seek reassurance. They don't apologize for things that aren't their fault. They don't over-explain. And because they carry themselves in this way, people assume they have something to back it up. People assume they know something they don't, that they have resources other people don't, that they're capable of things that might be beyond the normal person's reach. Now, the important thing here is that this isn't about deception. Real confidence is built on actual competence, actual resilience, actual options. But once you have those things, once you actually are someone who is harder to control, the way you carry yourself communicates that, and people respond accordingly. Think about it in terms of animals. There's a reason why a dog is more likely to bite a nervous, fearful person than a calm person. The nervous person is telegraphing vulnerability, fear, and unpredictability. The calm person is telegraphing stability and control. We see the same pattern in humans constantly. The vulnerable person gets exploited. The person who carries themselves calmly and confidently, who doesn't seem desperate or needy, is treated with more respect and more caution. And again, this is not a tactic to manipulate others. It's a genuine shift in who you are. Now let's talk about the active practices that move you toward this state of sovereignty. The first and most important is what we might call strategic vulnerability. You need to build a life where you have what Machiavelli might call reserves. Money in the bank, skills that are in demand, relationships with multiple people rather than one person you depend on, interests and projects that give you meaning beyond any single role. The reason this is so important is that it's almost impossible to be genuinely courageous when you're desperate. You can perform courage, but true courage requires that you're willing to accept consequences, and most people can't accept consequences when they're one step away from poverty or homelessness or total abandonment. So the boring, unglamorous work comes first. Save money, develop skills. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. Don't become so economically dependent on one person or one job that you have no ability to leave. Don't structure your entire emotional life around one relationship. Have friends, have hobbies, have projects, have sources of meaning that don't depend on any one person validating you. This isn't cold or antisocial. It's actually the opposite. The person who has a full life, who has options, who isn't desperate, is the person who can actually be generous and kind without it being a transaction. The second practice is what we might call deliberate social positioning. This is where it gets slightly more sophisticated and where people sometimes get uncomfortable because it can start to feel manipulative. But the core idea is simple. You should be conscious of the narrative that exists about you in the minds of people around you. And you should actively shape that narrative through your actions and your words. If you've been the person who always says yes, who always helps, who's always available and willing to sacrifice, you need to change that pattern. Not by becoming cold or selfish, but by starting to say no sometimes, by starting to take care of yourself, by becoming someone who has boundaries. This is genuinely one of the most powerful things you can do, and it works almost like magic. When you start saying no, when you start taking your time seriously, when you start acting like your energy and attention are valuable, people suddenly notice. They start respecting you more. They start taking you more seriously. They stop trying to exploit you as much. And the beautiful thing is that none of this requires you to be dishonest. You're genuinely changing how you allocate your time and energy. You're genuinely starting to protect yourself. The shift in how people treat you is just the natural response to that change. The third practice is what we might call information control. This is where Machiavelli becomes most subtle and where people most misunderstand him. The idea is not that you should lie or that you should be secretive in a paranoid way. The idea is that you should be strategic about what information you give to whom. In particular, you should not give people who have shown their untrustworthy information that they can use against you. You should not confess every weakness to people who have demonstrated that they'll exploit that vulnerability. You should not explain your decisions to people who are just looking for reasons to criticize or control you. This is hard for a lot of people because we're taught that honesty and vulnerability are always virtues, that we should be open with everyone, that keeping secrets is a sign of dishonesty. But that's not true. There's a difference between being honest and being foolish enough to give ammunition to people who would use it against you. If your boss has a track record of using personal information against you, you don't tell them about your mental health struggles. If your family member has shown they're judgmental, you don't explain your dating choices to them. If a person has demonstrated they can't keep a secret, you don't trust them with your vulnerabilities. This isn't dishonest, this is wisdom. And here's where it gets really interesting. Once you start protecting information strategically, once you stop explaining yourself to people who don't deserve an explanation, something shifts in your power. You become less legible to people. They can't quite figure you out. And humans are deeply uncomfortable with people they can't figure out. It makes them uneasy. They assign power to you that you might not even feel you have, because they can't predict what you'll do next. Meanwhile, you understand them completely, their motivations, their fears, their weaknesses. You're reading them while they're trying to figure you out. This asymmetry is where real power lives. Now, the final and perhaps most important principle is what we might call the psychological autonomy, the moment when you genuinely, in your bones, stop caring about whether people like you. This is not the same as not caring about people. It's not the same as becoming cold or disconnected. Most people live in a state of constant anxiety about what other people's approval has on your decision-making. They're modulating their behavior, their appearance, their words, their choices based on a calculation of what will make them more likable or more acceptable. This constant self-modulation is exhausting, and it's a form of control that's so subtle that most people don't even realize it's happening. The moment you release that, and I mean genuinely release it, not just tell yourself you've released it, everything changes. Suddenly you're not performing anymore. You're not contorting yourself into shapes that you think other people will find acceptable. You're just being yourself. And paradoxically, the moment you stop trying to make people like you, more people like you. Because authenticity is attractive. Confidence is attractive. The person who is comfortable in their own skin, who isn't desperate for validation, is far more appealing than the person who's constantly performing. But more importantly than being more likable, you become less controllable. Because once you genuinely don't care whether someone likes you, they have no leverage over you. The threat of rejection loses its power. The threat of abandonment loses its power. The threat of judgment loses its power. You're free. And this is where Machiavelli's insights become genuinely liberating rather than cynical. The person who understands how control works and who has made themselves immune to it is the person who actually gets to choose how they treat others based on their own values rather than based on fear. Let me paint a concrete picture of what this looks like in practice, because I think this is where most people get stuck. The gap between understanding the theory and actually living it. Imagine you're in a workplace situation where your boss is manipulative and controlling. He or she makes comments designed to make you feel inadequate. They take credit for your work. They make unreasonable demands and then blame you when they're not met. And you've been responding to this the way most people do, by working harder, by trying to prove your worth, by staying late, by over-explaining your decisions, by constantly seeking reassurance. Here's what happens when you apply these principles. First, you stop trying to prove yourself. Not because you stop caring about doing good work. You actually start doing better work because you're not doing it from a place of desperation anymore. But you stop the performance. You stop staying late just to be seen as committed. You stop over-explaining your decisions. You start saying things like, I disagree with that approach, but I understand you're the decision maker. And then you let it go. You stop seeking reassurance. You stop asking if you're doing okay. You just do the work and you move on. Second, you start quietly preparing your escape. You update your resume. You start looking at other jobs. You invest in your own skills. You network with people outside the company. You save money so that you're not totally dependent on this paycheck. You're not doing this aggressively or visibly. You're just quietly making yourself less dependent on this situation. And third, you change the narrative about yourself. You start carrying yourself differently. You're calmer. You're more direct. You don't seem as desperately eager to please. People notice. Your boss notices. And suddenly the dynamic shifts. The boss might suddenly become nicer to you, might give you more autonomy, might be less critical, not because you've manipulated them through some clever tactic, but because they're responding to the genuine shift in your availability to be controlled.